American Urban Utopias. So this is a very extensive topic, and of course what I'll offer today is a selective overview that in a sense reflects my own preferences, but also the way I try to weave a narrative of the American city starting from the early days of the Republic until the 21st century. So let's begin with the question of what is a utopia. That's a very simple question that is that we need to address, asking about the functions of utopian thinking. So the word utopia comes from two words from Greek. One of the words refers to the good place, utopia, and the other one, utopia, refers to a non-existent place of nowhere, which is basically utopia is a space, a place that we imagine, but it does not really exist. But generally, when we refer to the term utopia, or utopian thinking, or American urban utopias, which is the subject for today's speech, we think of an ideal place, utopia being a good place. We imagine, and once we imagine, we create, bring to life perfect societies. It's usually an ordered and harmonious whole that exists in opposition to, in relation to the everyday life that we do not accept and we would like to transform and improve. It's about beauty, perfection, and order. So what are the functions of utopias? Usually they express something that is lacking and missing in our society. They explore what is possible and impossible when it comes to the organization of social life. They also reveal our own utopian aspirations as regards our understanding of our own or other societies. They express a desire simply for a better life, and when it comes to desires, we have a hope of transformation. It's not really so much a wishful thinking with city planning and urban planning as willful thinking, a will to transform and change the surrounding reality in the process of creating a perfect society. Okay. Some of us may be familiar with Thomas More's utopian project of the early 16th century, which I'll use as a springboard for the discussion of American utopian projects. And Thomas More is writing at the times when communal lands, farming lands are shrinking. And therefore he is trying to come up with an ideal of society that would completely get rid of public property, especially massive privately owned farmlands and parklands that diminish farming lands for the farmers and peasants. Why I'm interested in Thomas More's Utopia is that it is a project that assumes we have a communal ownership of land, we have community dining halls, we have communal agricultural production, and we share resources and land, as opposed to the enclosure of the common land by the few landed aristocracy. So Thomas More's utopian project addresses, in my view, a different set of tensions that appear in utopian thinking. Number one, and the tension and conflict between individual freedoms and loyalty to the community. Number two, private property and the tension between communal property and private property. Number three, tension between organic communities and plant communities, organic communities that grow naturally from a small village to a small town, and then they develop as if naturally, organically into a multifunctional community, as opposed to plant communities. And finally, maybe not really the tension, but ask a question about the role of the state in achieving a more just and equitable society. And it's this tension, I believe, that plays itself out in American urban utopias. So in a sense, we're using the American material as a case study to talk about the way utopian thinking has permeated our development, cultural development. familiar with Thomas Jefferson's ideal of America as a garden, as a place that is complete antithesis to the industrial England of the era, that is the late 18th century, early 19th century industrial cities such as Manchester or Leeds, that embody all the corruptive forces that Thomas Jefferson associates with urban environment. So what is this agrarian pastoral ideal about? Jefferson believes that for America to be a democratic country, everybody should own land, and it's this possession of land and ownership of land in the hands of yeoman, self-sustaining farmers. That is the guarantee of the reproduction and stability of the American political and economic enterprise. So in short, when it comes to the unspoiled American landscape that we want to retain as a garden, and we want to create a classless society that would stand, again, in opposition to the working class wage laborers that are already being oppressed in England. So we have this, and manufacturing becomes, in Thomas Jefferson's mind, what the snake is to Eden. So manufacturing to American cities is what the snake was to Eden. I'm quoting from query number 19 from Notes on the State of Virginia. So what consequences would this kind of utopian thinking, imagining America as a garden, a place that is a rural country, and that is based on an agricultural economy? How does it translate into the ways Americans imagine urban growth and new urban centers that are not going to be commercial business centers anymore? Can we, as Americans, that's the state of mind and the discussion, the debates going on between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton at that time, whether America should have a national industry or whether it should retain an agricultural country as a warranty of American democratic order. Are we familiar with the word grid? The rectangular street system, the checkerboard kind of street organization that creates blocks. Right? This is what we see on the right-hand side, in the right-hand side picture, the grid of 1811, that is the grid, the commissioner's plan of New York, of how to build American cities on what has been left over by the colonial era New York owners and managers. This is the southern tip of Manhattan that was built up, and the remaining areas, the Lower East Side today, were the farmlands. So how do we develop American cities? What kind of values, social, economic, political, do we inscribe into space? Well, scholar Upton Dell points out that in the early days of the American Republic, we see the emergence of a spatial imagination, and an attempt to translate those non-spatial values, such as equality and democracy, into spatial terms. So the 19th century grid, as we see it in the slide, embodies the Republican virtues and assumes that each section of the grid, which is a pretty open pattern, there is no enclosure as such, is just an imposition of a non-specific general order that will be filled in with meaning by the choices of freely acting and self-determining individuals. So in other words, we assume that any kind of urban planning at this point, imposition of hierarchies in space, would be antithetical to the ideals of the American Republic that presuppose basic equality of all citizens. And an opposing view of how American cities should grow or develop when it comes to the planning of urban space would be Pierre L'Enfant's 1791 plan of Washington, which was to be built at that time, in the late decades of the last decade of the 18th century, as the would-be capital of the United States. And Pierre L'Enfant has proposed a completely different solution to the organization and the inscription of values in urban space. First of all, the grid. We didn't see it in the map before, but the grid does not respect the natural topography. So you first level the ground and then you erect new things and new structures. With Baroque planning, with planning that is organized around squares and circles and roundabouts and monuments as kind of points of reference, we have some places that are much more important than others. So when Pierre L'Enfant is thinking about Washington, he places Capitol Hill here and diagonally linking it with the White House. So these are the two building sites that would be interconnected with a system of radially going avenues that are superimposed on the grid, because after all we see the grid in the background. This plan would not be completed until the early years of the 20th century with the 1901 Commissioner's Plan that brings to life Washington and Washington Law as we know today. So should we have industry in America? That's the debates that I've already mentioned that dominate discussion among the founding fathers, and what are the solutions and how do we actually make sure America becomes a competitive economy in the global markets, and at that time Americans already start thinking globally. Well, one of the solutions would be a model company town, a small size, small village factories that would be organized in such a way that their owners, and one of their owners was David Humphreys, a friend of Jefferson's, who would make sure that they meet the economic and the social considerations of basic Americans at that time. That is, how to avoid what an average American would have thought, the demoralizing, the corruptive forces of factory labor. And coercive times benevolent paternalism is one of the solutions. David Humphreys imports merino sheep and to start a wool factory, a wool industry, and he employs farm girls as wage labor, and additionally brings in New York orphans as apprentices that are not paid labor, of course, as an apprentice. But then he creates, in a paternalistic fashion, a daily regime, very healthy diet, comfortable beds, early bedtimes, and a conducive environment for intellectual and professional development to those individuals. So, in a sense, David Humphreys places himself, acts in local parentis, in the replacing the authority of the parents. More contemporarily, scholars such as Richard Sennett have noticed that this kind of benevolent paternalism is not really, and does not really breed good habits when it comes to American citizenry and independence, and begets loyalty and subservience, if it does anything at all. A more advanced version of industrial era development that was inspired, that took into account some social considerations, for example, preoccupation of the farm girls' parents with the horrors of the city and what it does to an individual. And in Lowell, we don't really have benevolent paternalism anymore, but we have strict control of the farm girls. Discipline and disobedience Discipline is very strict, disobedience is punished. We have the moral police of the peer group, because the farm girls, who are usually temporary workers, live in boarding houses. So we have a stress on conformity rather than the expression of an individual. So, so far we see that there is an element of idealistic utopian thinking in those small individual projects of bringing industrialization or disseminating the idea of industrial society in America with an attention to what was then the major preoccupation of anti-urban thinkers, that is the destructive, the corruptive forces, as they were saying, of the city, of congestion, of filth and crowds and unhealthy environment. At the time, parallel with the development of industry in America, because this is what's happening after all, in spite of Jefferson's idealistic thinking about America remaining a yeoman's country, we have the emergence of bourgeois utopias. This is a term I'm borrowing from Robert Fishman, who generally refers to suburbia of any kind as bourgeois utopias. And in the United States, we trace the development of bourgeois utopias, suburban, exclusive, gated communities that are built and designed for the upper class, the professional class, and the well-to-do members of the American society, who, in a sense, express what is lacking in the American city. They show that they're running away. The anti-urban bias is very much grounded in the deficiencies of American industrial environment. So they run away into the security of an ideal home, and Fishman is kind of pointing out that this home becomes even more sacred than any other place of worship in America. It's an exclusive space in the sense that, of course, one social group has access to the place, as much as it is focused only or developed only around one single function, unlike organic communities that fulfill the commercial, administrative, business, cultural functions. So this is a residential suburb that is built on, as we can see in the corner picture on the left-hand side, Riverside near Chicago, designed more or less at the same time as Central Park, but the same designers, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. And as you see, it's far removed from the grid, because the grid is the urban thing. The curvaceous, the irregular, the winding lanes, a lot of natural, intact, wooded commons. This is what we find in the bourgeois utopias. Others call them romantic suburbs for the wealthy. So privacy and exclusivity and insistence on contact with nature, this exists in opposition to it as an idealized place that represents a marriage of what we have the best in town and country, in opposition to the dilapidated, dirty, congested, badly smelling cities of industrial America. Some of us may be familiar with Lowell Park near New York, and that's the kind of architecture you can come across. Thomas Edison's house, huge spacious real estates, no limit as to the size of the lot that is nicely, the place is nicely landscaped and located. Not much of car traffic. This is the PreCar Era, so we have a rail connection to the metropolitan area, and of course this is a condition of exclusivity, because not everyone can afford the train fare to commute to the main to the metropolitan areas. So the kind of difficult connection or expensive fare would be an exclusive, an excluding criterion as such. But of course, in this idealized suburban natural environment, we appreciate the fresh air, no pollution, safety and security, everything that the city does not stand for. Okay. And when we speak about American industrial cities, 19th century, in the 19th century, we have New York and Chicago become Chicago as two major metropolitan areas, and Chicago becomes the hog butcher of the world, the Midwestern metropolis that lives off the stockyards at the meat, that is meatpacking industry, and a very frequent association with the stockyards of the turn of the century, turn of the 19th and 20th century would be the filthy and garbage-filled alleys, foul-smelling animal corpses lying in the streets, and overcrowded tenement houses, deteriorating living conditions that, as everybody believes, affect people's moral behaviors. And that's the kind of physical environment that leads people into crime, prostitution, different kinds of vice that is not accepted by social reformers, philanthropists, people who have at least a certain middle class status and standing. Chicago of that time, that is the last decade of the 19th century, is known also for its splendid project that is the White City, built of plaster on Lake Michigan, an impressive neoclassical project inspired by École des Beaux-Arts, the French School of Architecture, that is grand, that is monumental, impressive, and it's the architecture of the civic realm, of the public realm. But White City is a city on its own, this utopian space within the city, the industrial, filthy, polluted city of Chicago, that commemorates the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. And Chicago wants to promote itself as a Midwestern metropolis, but also there are a lot of national ambitions that come into play here, and the Americans want to show the world, you know, what kind of architectural designs and urban planning they are able to produce and build with their own resources, with the French architects of American origin. And the designer behind this project was Daniel Burnham, who later in 1901 was also involved in a new plan for the development of Chicago, which never came into fruition. This kind of interest in monumental, grand public buildings is very much connected to the City Beautiful movement. It's again a civic public reform movement that assumes that you can affect people's behaviors, build loyalty to among urban population. We have to keep in mind, for example, New York and Chicago, these are excessively immigrant communities, so we have discussions taking place in the last decades of the 19th century. You know, what kind of Americans do we want to achieve with Americanization projects and endeavors? Right? What are these alien immigrants to be? How to make them into good Americans? But at the same time, public and city planning reformers, they are engaged in what some call positive environmentalism, this is basically environmental determinism. They assume that once you create beautiful, nicely landscaped places as sites of contact and social interaction. That was also the idea behind Central Park, which didn't have all the grand neoclassical structures. You can actually increase social cohesiveness, that is unity. You can create a surge in civic public loyalty. Remember, this is the time of socialism and anarchism and the working classes in American industrial cities organizing against capitalist exploitation. So Americans are really preoccupied with soothing the kind of civil discontent that is that is present among the industrial workers of America. So it's with these kinds of projects, including the completion of the Washington Mall and Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial and Lincoln's statue, that we want to affect people's behaviors, that we want to make them into new citizens, creating livable and attractive urban spaces so that we can, as if, stop urban decay in terms when you mean morally, socially, physically. So it's in the statues and fountains that we know from Baroque planning, and it's in tree-lined avenues and boulevards that you see a solution to the oppressive, devastating, unhappy lives of the American working class. So positive environmentalism is about wiping out the slum areas and to create a new civic realm that would, as if, affect people's attitudes and behaviors. That's what the City Beautiful movement is about. Charles McKim, a close associate of Daniel Burnham, who stands behind the White City project, was the chief designer of Columbia University campus, and this is just one shot of the campus library of the times. I'm going to skip over, which is something that's my favorite subject, the Garden City idea, that is a reformist movement started by Ebenezer Howard in England, of building decent homes, creating decent living conditions for the English working class. In a sense, combining within a new urban environment built completely from scratch, everything that is best in the countryside and everything that is best in the city. Like clean air, lower rents, etc. And the Garden City project is about already an attempt to organize regional development both in England and then American Regional Planning Association is inspired by Ebenezer Howard's attempts to impose some kind of orderly plan of development as opposed to chaotic, uncontrolled growth of the peripheral areas surrounding the metropolis. Okay. One of the Garden City projects that is very often referred to in the American context is the Depression era Radburn, New Jersey suburban environment that introduces cul-de-sac, that is a dead-end street, and separates pedestrian traffic from automobile traffic. And Radburn, New Jersey is the town of the motor age, in the sense that we have the cars that are parked in the streets leading up to apartments, but all the social life is as if organized around the gardens that look out onto the common areas, connected with a network of passageways and pedestrian walkways. So we have a completely safe environment, which is something very appealing for American parents. unfortunately, Radman ends up being an affluent WASP community. Number one, real estate is so expensive they can't really afford to make it into a decent living environment for decent Americans. Number two, the Depression era stops the projects, and if you think about Radburn, only a small section of it is developed and functional until today. Right. Is anyone familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright's, American famous architect's, urban vision of America, the broadacre city? The different colors stand for the different functions. I already mentioned suburban areas as being residential areas only, and here Frank Lloyd Wright is imagining in the 1930s America that is growing, developing around a system of highways and expressways, and it's an open plan. There is no end to it. He imagines all of America being one decentralized area, sprawling suburban areas, but we have one city finishing in another and beginning. But then he's saying everyone has their own city. Each dweller would form their own city, driving at 60 miles an hour within an hour's drive. This is your city. So there is no single city that he actually has in mind. But Frank Lloyd Wright is important because he is trying to implement, in the best idealistic possible manner, the ideals of yeoman democracy, rooted in possession of land, right, with the possibilities and the scale of the city that is changing with the automobile and the way of life organized around the automobile. So he believes that every individual should have equal access to land, but we can't really introduce any more control or organize people's lives, because that would lead, the kind of equality, if we wanted to impose it, would lead to some kind of tyranny. So that's not what we want. But generally, the broadacre spreads out into the countryside at low densities, and it's an attempt to re-inhabit rural areas, right? Rural areas, and develop, create growth and development along major highways and arterial roads. Indeed, broadacre, this picture, except for the colorful representation, is not as appealing as a translation, I would say, although Bel Geddes, who we see here in the picture, might not really agree, but definitely scholars say he was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of sprawling America, but America that would sprawl, develop according to a certain plan, unlike the termites and the locusts of the city. So in his book, Bel Geddes has a book, Motor City, where he speaks about suburbanites who leave the city and to go back to their cheap suburban homes, and the termites, that is the lower classes, as if destroy the fabric of the urban from within invisibly. We don't really want that kind of urban development. So Bel Geddes is commissioned in the 1930s to create a diorama of America, a vision of the future, a vision of not so distant a future in the 1960s. And this is built in a huge spherical pavilion. The whole structure is called Trilon and Perisphere, where inside he builds a vision of America to be seen by millions of visitors that are taken on a tour, as you see them hanging up there, on a tour of America to imagine the city of tomorrow, that is the city in the 1960s. High rises, multi-lane highways, everything is subordinate to the automobile, and we don't have any filth, any decay, because we have demolished all the deteriorated housing, and we have erected those beautiful, imposing, impressive high-rise structures that are really sustainable. There is no pollution. We have a lot of control over our space. This is how Bel Geddes imagines America of tomorrow in the 1960s. This vision, both Frank Lloyd Wright's and Bel Geddes' Futurama, are not such a distant vision from what really happened in America in the post-suburban world. If you think of technoburbs, I'm again borrowing this term from Robert Fishman, who other scholars like Joel Garreau would call them edge cities. Technoburbs are the peripheral zones that in themselves have become independent socio-economic units that spread around and along highway corridors. And it's at the intersection of these either beltways or highways or expressways that we have shopping malls, campus-like offices, hospitals, schools, and develop. This is the technoburb. This is the sprawling suburban environment that has become actually, Los Angeles being the prototype here, the sprawling, decentered city. The suburbia becomes the city. It does not need the core city, that is the metropolis, anymore to exist in a peripheral relationship of dependence. It's a separate entity. And the whole metropolitan area, in this kind of, if we follow this kind of logic, is not the techno-burb, but the techno-city that is transformed at the techno-burb as a basic urban form. I haven't mentioned, and some of you who are familiar with Le Corbusier were wondering probably why I haven't mentioned Le Corbusier, but there is a certain kind of linear narrative that I'm following, and there are some ruptures here. And of course, Le Corbusier is a Swiss architect who is sometimes praised, sometimes criticized for his modernist urban visions that were also oriented towards implementing social change. In 1924, and this is where I see Frank Lloyd Wright's inspiration for the Broadacre, as much as Bel Geddes' inspiration in Le Corbusier and his idea of the radiant city. A kind of parkland city, a city of the future, imagined as a better society, a classless society, where in units of 14 stories or higher, we have classless, equal people living. They are sharing communal halls, kitchen, nursery, schools. So there is some kind of interaction and contact and social cohesion that Le Corbusier wanted to achieve with also those equalitarian goals. So he is preoccupied with equality, but also communities and public good. Well, this utopian project is borrowed by American city planners. And the federal authorities that are really preoccupied in the post-Depression era with the deteriorating housing stock in the American city. And they want to subsidize public housing to create a better living environment for the poor people, or for lower classes. And they are really hugely inspired by Le Corbusier's Radiant City project. So how can the city contribute to the good life, to a better life? Well, you create living towers in a parkland. You get rid of the grid. You get rid of the grid, so you basically eliminate the grid system, and you create a superblock. And a superblock is differently defined, but it's the intersection, the space filled in between the intersection of highways and beltways. So we're completely changing the scale for the automobile traffic. And you separate whole swaths of land, be it St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe projects, or be it East Harlem, be it Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, right? We have this drive, this motivation in the 1940s and 50s in America to build federal housing, subsidized housing for poor people. Well, we want them to have new, good, nicely looking homes that are not deteriorated or rat infested. And originally, even lower class Americans are very interested. They sign up to be part of the project, but at some point it turns out they are not eligible because they are not poor enough. So what happens? We have depopulation of existing areas and reintroduction of the complete exchange population. And for example, in the case of East Harlem, we have Puerto Ricans moving in, but the Italians and the Jewish people are looking for new places to live in the Bronx or Staten Island. In the 1960s, scholars and writers such as Urban Utopias in his book Urban Villagers, and Jane Jacobs in her book The Life and Death of American Cities, that thanks to Maciek, who is in the audience here, has been translated into Polish. And they point to the devastating effects of urban renewal and slum clearance projects that, as their ideal, had creation of better, decent housing for the impoverished people or poor people, working class people. What those projects ended up doing was engaging in some kind of preparing ground for upscale development. But also, I already mentioned the grid. We have those originally beautiful parkways, playgrounds, lawns, and trees, and we create an idyllic pastoral landscape. It's a good society that we are offering as a replacement to the tenement houses of the late 19th century. It's Le Corbusier's vision implemented. We have those living towers in a park. What else can we offer? Well, it turns out that those residential areas do not have jobs. It turns out it's the 1950s and the 1960s that the American industry and industrial force is shrinking. People who are confined to those beautifully landscaped high towers cannot commute to other areas in the city because there is no way they can do this. Very few of them have cars. So we have a chain of problems that is triggered with, number one, elimination of the grid, and as if creating, implementing, in a sense, literally, the vision, Le Corbusier's vision of a monofunctional community. A monofunctional community that is a residential community that does not even have the shops for people to shop in the vicinity. But of course, it fulfills this it creates fulfillment of the ideal of America being a garden, and we have a garden in the American city, in the era that, in a sense, precedes community gardening on the large scale as we see it today. So we have seen the high-rise projects collapse, backfire. We have seen them demolished. By the 1950s and even until today, we see many high-rise projects demolished we agree that Le Corbusier's vision of monofunctional communities did not really work out in the particular context in which they were implemented. Now, in the 80s, Miami-based architects, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zibberg, they announced a return to the urban village. They do it because they want to counter the negative effect of sprawl, the chaotic, unorganized, uncontrolled development and suburban tract development that really created monofunctional states where we had a lot of alienation. That's the language of the Chicago school that basically assumes, like some of you may be familiar with Lewis Worth's text, Urbanism is a Way of Life, that it's in the city that you experience the breakdown of communal bonds. So new urbanists are on a mission that, again, is inspired by the great thinker and critic and journalist Jane Jacobs, because Jane Jacobs is the one who pointed to the importance of streetscapes and streets for the existence for community life and for creating what Herbert Gask has called urban villages. But Jane Jacobs was never positive, unless I'm wrong, about suburbia. She was speaking about coming back to the city and retaining old, traditional, multifunctional, mixed-use, ethnically diverse communities. And she was a romantic. She was a gentrifier in Greenwich Village. We have to keep this in mind. And so new urbanists want to retrofit the suburbia. What does this mean? It means they want to make the suburban landscape denser, make it more friendly for pedestrian traffic and for social face-to-face interaction. They want to create, with urban planning, of course, as a tool, a way of life that would stimulate friendliness, neighborliness, and openness, and therefore they have created such landmark projects as Celebration in Florida. And Celebration has been extensively written about because, well, Sharon Zukin calls it a theme park. It's a community that was built from scratch by the Disney company. So they don't really have the municipal government or mayor, they just have a Disney manager being in control of public space. And new urbanists are really very attentive to the kind of local heritage architecture that they want to bring into their planning. They're really preoccupied with densely built urban spaces designed so that people interact and get into touch with each other and become friendly and neighborly, but also they pay attention to contact zones. The porch is the community zone. The backyard is the private zone. And it's in the porch where, the porch, which is a semi-public space, that becomes this space of social interaction. So just to sum up, new urbanist projects are idealistic because they want to return to paradise lost, to a community, an old-time traditional small-town community that, well, many believe never existed in its myth. But they want to do it with planning tools and covenants and rules and regulations. So, for example, in Celebration, Florida, you as a house owner, you have to sign a covenant, declaration of covenants that says, I will hold a garage sale on a certain day only, or at certain intervals, and I will have the a specific kind of curtains in my house, or I'll grow certain kinds of shrubs in my front yard, because this is all regulated by a Disney company. But in other new urbanist projects, we have the Homeowners Association, that is the sole decision-making body which can impose, again, some restrictions on people's management of their land. And new urbanist projects are not always so attractive. Number one, there is some kind of a trade-off. You have a smaller piece of ground, you have a smaller garden, you have a smaller backyard, and your freedom is limited to a certain degree. And also, some think that those sugar-coated reproductions of small-town, old-town America are, in a sense, a tool of control of community building. So we end in a sense, on a very sad note, speaking about urban planning that begins with the grid and Republican ideals and equality and some kind of democratic freedoms and the threats, in opposition to the threats and horrors of industrialization. And we end up with this very romantic movement of urban planning that makes community building a tool of community control. Okay. Right. So, as a conclusion, maybe to wrap up the different kinds of threads I've been pulling here, American urban utopias, of course, offer a critique of the life as we know it. But they are also some kind of an attempt to create a perfect and ideal society. Utopias, American urban utopias, as much as bourgeois utopias exemplified in this presentation, are a kind of compensation for what is missing, what is lost, what is not, what is lacking in our lives. And oftentimes, utopias are also a result of certain political transformative force among urban planners, philanthropists, reformers. And American utopias address the tension between the democratic ideals and the marketplace, that is the creation of exploited workforce, between individual freedoms and loyalty to the community, between how to organize planned communities as opposed to the myth of organic communities that is very well represented by new urbanist projects, and the tension between diversity that is so characteristic of urban environment and homogeneity that characterizes, specifically we think of it, the post-World War II suburbia that are often, I think Richard Sennett refers to them as purified communities. So the purification of anything that is filthy, that is not really standard, that does not represent our value systems and expectations. And of course, when it comes to American urban utopias, we have to keep in mind the role of planners in agricultural design, such as exemplified by the City Beautiful movement, in achieving a more just and equitable society. Thank you.